Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back, way back into the slop and soot of medieval life. You're not wearing chainmail, you're not clutching a sword, and you're definitely not feasting at some royal banquet. No, you're a peasant, dirt under your fingernails, aching from dawn to dusk labour, and staring down a dinner that smells like boiled defeat. That's right, tonight is all about what cheap meals medieval people ate just to stay alive. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious, what city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the rough wooden door of your hovel. The hinges groan like they're in pain. Inside, the air is damp and smoky, carrying the faint aroma of wet straw and something boiling that smells almost, but not quite, edible. The hearth at the centre is your lifeline, though tonight, like most nights, it's just a small stubborn flame flickering under a cracked iron pot. You poke the bubbling contents, a watery porridge made of barley, oat husks and a pinch of onion. Maybe, could just be dirt. This is pottage. It's dinner, breakfast and sometimes lunch, if you can spare the firewood. It's not soup, it's thicker than that. Kind of sludgy hot slurry that sticks to your ribs and your wooden spoon. The colour is always a little sad, brownish grey with a slick sheen on top that could be grease or just fat from last week's feast day bones. You slurp it without ceremony, because there's no ceremony in poverty. You reach for the hunk of bread resting on the table, not a fresh loaf, not fluffy or golden. This is maslin bread, made from a mix of whatever grains you could scrounge, barley, rye, maybe even a little wheat if the tax collector wasn't looking. It's heavy, chewy. It was baked 3 days ago. If you're lucky, you dunk it in the pottage to soften it. Otherwise, it's like chewing a sandal. The crust might draw blood from your gums if you're not careful. A common trick is to chew it slowly until it softens, sort of like how cows do with cud. Except you're not a cow. You're just broke. This meal is more survival kit than cuisine. But hey, it keeps you going, just barely. You glance over at the family across the room, your parents, maybe a sibling or two, maybe a goat in the corner who refuses to make eye contact. Everyone eats from the same pot, one after the other, because bowls are a luxury and spoons are worth more than your entire outfit. The youngest gets fed first, then the elders, then whoever's left. You're eating in what's called an open hearth kitchen. The smoke stains everything, your clothes, your lungs, the ceiling beams. Chimneys are rare. Most of the smoke just floats around aimlessly like a ghost with nowhere better to be. You've learnt not to cry from the sting anymore. Factually speaking, historians agree that gruel and pottage were dietary staples for the poor across medieval Europe. It was easy to make in bulk, cheap to keep simmering and required almost no specialised cooking tools, just a pot and something flammable. Grain was the backbone of the peasant diet. Wheat, the good stuff, was usually reserved for the upper classes or the church. You get the cast-offs: barley, oats, rye. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found traces of thistle, nettle, and even moss in the charred remains of old pottage pots. Yes, moss, as in from trees or stones. It turns out when you're desperate, your palate expands dramatically. There's an open debate among scholars about how truly bad these meals were. Some argue that medieval peasants had surprisingly nutritious diets because they grew their own vegetables and used seasonal herbs. Others say the quality of food was so inconsistent and famine so frequent that people were chronically malnourished, especially in colder regions. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. You weren't starving every day, but you definitely weren't thriving. You were eating to not die. As the fire crackles and the shadows dance across the soot-blackened walls, you set your bowl aside and rub your stomach. You're not full. Full isn't a thing here, but you're not empty either. And that's what matters. There's a sense of strange comfort in the routine. Boil the grain, scrape the bottom of the pot, chew the crust, share the spoon. This is life. It isn't exciting, but it's yours. And tomorrow you'll do it again, unless the harvest fails, or the taxes go up, or the Lord demands more barley, or the weather turns. You sit back and stare at the fire, mind drifting, as the pottage settles like gravel in your belly. You imagine what it must be like to eat meat every day, to have a plate instead of a slab of bark, to not count the days since your last egg. But imagination is a dangerous luxury too, so you lean your head against the wall, feeling the warmth from the hearth fade inch by inch. Outside a dog barks, A rooster you hate announces nothing useful. The stars blink above a thatched roof barely holding together. Somewhere down the dirt road, someone else is eating their own version of the same sad stew. But hey, you're not dead, yet. You wake to the sound of chickens squabbling under the slats of the floorboards. They're your alarm clock, your breakfast, if one lays an egg, and occasionally your emotional support animals, not that you'd admit it. The hearth is cold now, just a few grey embers sulking in the ashes. There's no time to sit around. Today you're helping gather food, again, because cheap meals don't make themselves, and the only thing more constant than your hunger is your dependence on the land around you. You grab a woven basket and a knife that's seen better centuries. It's early morning and the grass is damp. Your feet squish in your worn leather shoes, or maybe they're just foot-shaped fabric by now. You head toward the edge of the fields, careful not to step on anything of value, like the single carrot someone managed to grow last week. You're not here for crops, you're here for the in-between stuff, the kind of greenery that doesn't belong to anyone officially, but might earn you a beating if you get caught gathering it too close to the Lord's woods. This is where you get the good stuff. Nettles, wild garlic, dandelion greens, sorrel, things that sting your fingers or make your tongue curl, but that, when boiled into pottage, suddenly feel like a garnish sent from heaven. The old woman, 2 huts down, swears by dock leaves steeped in brine for stomach cramps. Someone else mentioned purslane, which sounds like a fancy French dish but is really just a succulent weed. You even spot a cluster of mushrooms growing under a fallen log. You squint at them, wondering if they're the edible kind or the kind that will have you speaking Latin backward before your heart stops. Better leave them be. Foraging is both an art and a gamble. You're walking a thin line between nutrition and nausea, and more importantly, between legal and illegal. The Lord's forest is rich in wild things, hazelnuts, berries and small game. But that's not for you, not unless you're ready to get caught poaching. The penalties for poaching make starvation look like the gentler option. A breeze rolls through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and mould, and maybe even faint smoke from a faraway fire. You pick more nettles, careful to fold the leaves inward so you don't sting your skin. Later, boiled in water with a dash of barley, they'll lose their bite and taste vaguely like spinach that hates you. Let's pause for a second and drop a historical truth bomb. Foraging was a fundamental part of survival for the rural medieval poor. What modern-day people romanticize as wild crafting or organic foraging was just a necessity. Peasants didn't always have access to enough cultivated crops, especially during lean seasons. And even though the land was theoretically common in some areas, feudal lords had strict rules about who could touch what, especially when it came to game and high-value plants like nuts or medicinal herbs. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. People really did eat acorns. They'd grind them into a coarse meal after leaching out the tannins, which otherwise made your mouth pucker like you'd licked a pine cone. It wasn't exactly a gourmet treat, but in desperate times you'd choke it down with some ale and call it a hearty snack. Your basket is getting heavier, not from bulk, but from the sense of possibility. Handful of wood sorrel, a pocket full of chickweed. You even snag a few wild onions that somehow managed to escape last year's harvest. A win is a win. You pause near the hedge line to inspect a patch of mint, breathing in its sharp, clean scent. It's rare, it's precious, and it might just save the taste of tomorrow's barley sludge. Then a twig snaps behind you. You freeze. Not from fear, okay, maybe a little fear, but from experience. You turn slowly. It's just old Wolf, the shepherd with no sheep, muttering to himself and chewing on a leather strap. He nods at your basket and says something that might be a warning or a recipe. Either way, you nod back and edge away. You head home, now walking the same path with different eyes trained to spot tiny miracles. A snail maybe, if you're lucky. A few wild blackberries, though half are already pecked apart by birds. This isn't just scavenging, it's crafting a meal from nothing, a kind of daily desperate alchemy. And here's where scholars still debate. Was this patchwork diet enough? Some argue that seasonal foraging made the medieval peasant diet surprisingly varied and full of micronutrients. Others say it was too inconsistent to do any real good, especially when heavy labour demanded calories peasants just didn't get. Most likely it depended on geography. A peasant in southern France could forage year-round. One in northern England, not so much in February. By the time you're back at your hut, your stomach's growling and your fingers are stained green. You dump the contents of your basket onto the table, sorting things by whether they need boiling, soaking, or simply not eating at all. You'll throw most of it into the pot tonight, maybe saving a sprig or two of the nicer herbs to chew slowly when no one's looking. Dinner's not going to be good, but it'll be interesting, and that's enough. The sun dips lower, casting gold across the muddy yard. A dog howls in the distance. You sit back on a bench made from a single log and run your fingers over a sprig of mint like it's the finest silverware. This gathering, this sorting, this boiling is your reality. You're not a hunter. You're not a farmer. You're a forager with a working knowledge of what won't kill you. Yet, the first thing you notice when you wake up the next morning is the cold. Not a sharp biting cold, but that damp sort of chill that settles into your bones and makes every joint feel like it's made of old wood. You roll over, stretching out under your blanket, which is just a patched up woolen sack, and breathe in the smell of earth, ash, and yesterday's boiled herbs. It's not exactly mouthwatering, but your stomach, loyal and insistent, growls anyway. It's time to face the peasant pantry. You crouch beside the hearth, coaxing a little life from the ashes with a bit of straw and a breath that's more hopeful than practical. Eventually, a tiny flame licks at the edge of a twig, and you nudge some bark onto it, whispering encouragement like it's a petulant child. While the fire sputters into life, you stand and creak open the wooden cupboard, or rather the crate you use as one. Inside is your kingdom. A few clay pots sealed with wax, a sack of barley, a lump of salt hardened into a brick, and a jar of something suspiciously green. You don't look directly at that last one. It might be pickled cabbage, or it might be your aunt's last attempt at cheese. Grain is your gold. Not the shiny kind that gets you out of paying taxes, just the kind that keeps your bowels moving and your body upright. You run your hands through the rough barley, marvelling at how gritty it feels, like it's always coated in dust no matter how many times you rinse it. You scoop a portion into a wooden bowl and head back to the hearth, already planning how to stretch this into 2, maybe 3 meals. Add water, a few nettles from yesterday's haul, and whatever that shriveled thing is in the corner, onion, and you've got the start of another pottage. The medieval pantry isn't much of a pantry, it's more like a survival corner. Some dried beans when you're lucky. A few stripling of dried turnip hanging from the rafters, maybe a jar of lard that you guard like treasure. Lard is crucial, it adds richness, keeps things from burning and occasionally masquerades as a flavour all its own. You scoop a fingertip's worth into the pot any more and someone might notice, and watch it melt like it's something sacred. Let's take a moment to ground all this in the historical truth. For peasants, the medieval kitchen wasn't just minimalist. It was a daily juggling act. Barley, rye, oats, and dried legumes were the stars of the pantry, not because they were glamorous, but because they were cheap, storable, and kept you upright. You didn't cook so much as negotiate with the ingredients. There were no written recipes, no spices, unless someone died and left you a pinch of mustard seed, and very few guarantees that what you made wouldn't taste like despair. But if it was warm and didn't kill you, it was a success. Here's a quirky fact for your mental snack drawer. People in the Middle Ages fermented just about anything they could get their hands on. Cabbage, turnips, even fish heads. Some households kept what's essentially an eternal stew pot simmering day and night, endlessly refilled with scraps and roots and bones, becoming a sort of living soup with a personality all its own. If you're thinking that sounds like it might develop a consciousness, you wouldn't be the first to wonder. But debates still stir in scholarly circles over whether the peasant diet was chronically deficient or accidentally balanced. Some evidence suggests that while calorically limited, these basic pantry items, especially with the addition of herbs and pulses, provided more nutrition than early industrial diets centuries later. Others argue that nutrient gaps, especially in iron and protein, were the silent killers behind many peasant ailments, especially among women and children. What we do know is that life expectancy was grim, and malnutrition didn't exactly help. Back at your hearth, the pot bubbles. You stir slowly with a stick-turned spoon, watching the grains bloom and soften. It smells earthy, like a meal and compost all in one. You crumble a dried leaf into it, maybe parsley, maybe something your cousin claimed was mint, and sit back to let it simmer. Around you, the pantry continues to whisper hints of meals that could be. A bundle of dried peas hangs above the hearth, shriveled and waiting for a feast day that may never come. A cracked jug of vinegar leans in the corner, both seasoning and medicine, depending on who you ask. There's even a knot of garlic, mostly mould by now, but still useful for warding off whatever mysterious illness is floating through the village this week. Or, if you're feeling dramatic, vampires. You let your eyes rest on the sack of grain again. Grain is central to everything. You pay rent with it, taxes with it, and pray there's enough left to keep from boiling your boots when winter comes. Most people think bread was the mainstay, but for you it's grain in any form, ground, boiled, mashed or baked into something that might pass for sake if you squint and lie. The fire crackles, the pot thickens, and you ladle out the pottage into your shared wooden bowl. There's a thin layer of oil on top from the lard, catching the morning light like a dirty halo. You blow on it, take a sip and nod. It's hot, salty, vaguely plant adjacent. Good enough? You hand it off to the kid sitting cross-legged near the door, who slurps it without thanks. That's not rude, that's just how it works here. You lean back, bowl in hand, and take stock of what's left. Not much, but then again it never is. You've learnt not to panic when the stores run low. Something always turns up, another root, another handful of barley. Someone always barters something. You trade mending work for dried herbs, or offer to sharpen a knife in exchange for a heel of bread. It's not theft, it's survival. As you eat brisaos, you glance up at the rafters. Above, bundles of dried nettles, tansy and rosemary sway gently in the draught. You wonder which one will end up in tonight's stew, and which one you'll burn as incense just to mask the smell of damp wool and overcooked legumes. The fire pops, sending a burst of sparks toward the dark ceiling, and you smile. Not because you're happy, but because the food is hot, your belly's less empty, and for a moment, you're winning the day. It's baking day. Not that kind of baking day. No warm cinnamon swirls or golden, fluffy buns here. This is the one day in the week when your village lines up, sacks in hand outside the communal oven like it's a medieval drive-through. Except the wait is longer, the bread is heavier, and the only thing guaranteed is soot on your sleeves and a fistful of flour in your lungs. Still, it's the highlight of your culinary calendar. You've been hoarding your grain allowance for 3 days, carefully grinding it on your family's worn quern stone until your arms felt like they'd fall off, all to turn a few scoops of flour into something vaguely loaf-shaped. You carry your lump of dough, a pale, sticky mass flecked with bits of husk and who knows what wrapped in a cloth. You worked in just enough water to hold it together, threw in a pinch of salt, luxury, and let it sit overnight on the hearth's edge, where it picked up a bit of sour tang. It smells alive. It probably is. That's your starter, fermented from flour, spit, thyme, and stubborn hope. If it doesn't rise, it's still bread. Technically. The communal oven squats at the edge of the village green like a clay beast with a blackened mouth. It's dome-shaped, crusted with soot, and radiates the kind of heat that makes your eyebrows twitch. The baker, if you can call him that, is just the guy with the long paddle and the shortest temper. He doesn't smile, he rarely talks, he just opens the door, slaps in a round of loaves and moves on to the next like a one-man fire god. You wait your turn trying not to drop your dough in the dirt. There's chatter in the line, mostly grumbling about who stole whose yeast and which family added sawdust to their flour again. Everyone's dough looks different, some neat and round, some limp and wet, one shaped vaguely like a pig, probably made by a bored child or a particularly optimistic adult. Your own loaf feels modest but determined. You hand it over, marked with a little X you carved in the top so you can recognise it later. Then you step back and wait. Historically, these communal ovens were a cornerstone of peasant life in many medieval villages. Fuel was expensive and space was limited, so baking happened en masse, usually once or twice a week. Each household prepared their own dough, and the oven keeper, often appointed by the manor or church, would bake everyone's loaves for a fee or a portion of the final product. It wasn't optional either. In many places, you were legally required to use the Lord's oven, and baking elsewhere could get you fined or punished. Even if you wanted to do it on your own hearth, the firewood cost alone made that a fool's game. While you wait, you watch the baker's assistant pull out the previous batch, now baked into crusty, almost aggressive-looking loaves. Some are perfect, round and golden, but most are squat, split down the middle, or slightly burned on one side. People smile as they collect them. A loaf is a loaf, and in a world where your calorie count depends on the weather, a dense wheel of rye bread is as precious as gold. When your loaf finally comes out, it's a little flatter than you'd hoped. One side's darker than the other, and it smells a bit fermented. You tear off a hunk. It's dense, moist in the middle, chewy in a way that makes your jaw sore. There are bits of grit in it, probably from the millstones that shed tiny flecks of rock into the flour. But it's yours, and it's edible, and for the next few days it'll anchor every meal you eat. Quirky fact for you? Bread wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. People literally used bread as plates. Called trenchers, these were thick slabs of stale bread placed under meat and stew at the rare feast. Once soaked with juice and fat, they'd either be eaten or, if you were fancy, given to the poor. And yes, by given we mean tossed out the back door like edible napkins. Scholars still argue about the nutritional value of medieval bread. On one hand, the use of whole grains meant it had more fibre and micronutrients than modern white bread. On the other hand, the frequent contamination with chaff, ergot fungus or plain old dirt made it a bit of a dietary landmine. Some years, when the grain was bad, bread could actually poison people. But in the best of times, it was hearty, filling and central to survival. You carry your loaf home wrapped in the same cloth, warm through the fabric, like a stone that smells faintly of hope. On the way, you tear off another piece and chew as you walk, jaw working slowly, crumbs catching in your beard, or your neckline if you're not sporting facial hair. Each bite is earthy, sour, maybe a little funky. You don't mind. It beats chewing bark, which is not an exaggeration for what happens in the worst winters. At home, you slice off a chunk with your dull knife and dip it in some leftover stew. The bread soaks up the grease like a sponge, softening just enough to go down easy. You feed a bite to the youngest kid, who sucks on it like it's candy. The rest you wrap back up and hide in the safest place you know, under the floorboard with the less mouldy turnips. Tomorrow it might be stale, the next day it might be rock hard. But even stale bread has purpose. You can soak it in broth, fry it in lard if you've got it, or use it as stuffing inside a half-rotten cabbage. If things get desperate, you can gnaw it down to a nub and convince yourself it's medicinal. As evening falls, you sit outside with your loaf beside you and watch the sky turn a smoky blue. You don't have much, but today you have bread. And if that's not a reason to feel briefly victorious in a century where people die from stepping on a rusty nail, then what is? You wake up before the sun and before the roosters, which honestly feels like a personal insult. The hearth is cold, the air is damp, and the loaf of bread you so proudly hauled home yesterday now feels like a stone with abandonment issues. You tap it against the table, and it makes a dull thunk, possibly the saddest sound you've heard today. But you're not here to complain, you're here to get breakfast, and in the medieval world that means ale. Yes, really. Welcome to Alewife Alley. You duck your head beneath the low door frame of the alehouse, a thatched, smoky hut pressed against the side of someone's barn, and are immediately hit by the sharp, yeasty tang of brewing. It smells like old socks mixed with vinegar and optimism. The floor is sticky, the benches sag, the mood is sleepy but hopeful. A few others are already here, hunched over wooden mugs filled with the day's first pour, eyes red and fingers wrapped tight around their only comfort. Ale in the morning isn't about getting drunk. Not exactly. It's about survival. Water isn't safe. Not usually. It might look clear enough in the stream, but drink too much and you'll spend the day vomiting in the bushes, which does not pair well with harvesting turnips or carrying rocks uphill for 6 hours. Ale, on the other hand, has been boiled, brewed and blessed with just enough alcohol to kill off the worst of the bacteria, making it not only drinkable but weirdly nutritious. It's the medieval smoothie. The woman behind the counter, the alewife, is already hard at work. She's got flour on her sleeves, her hair tied back with twine, and the kind of permanent squint that comes from years of smoke, stress, and ignoring male nonsense. She's stirring a vat with a paddle the size of your thigh. The grains float lazily at the top, steaming and frothing as the mash thickens. You nod to her, she grunts back. It's practically a marriage proposal by local standards. Historically, alewives were central to medieval life. Most brewing happened at home, and women ran the show. They brewed, sold, and sometimes even taxed their ale, all from the same smoky corner of the village. Brewing was a skill, and one passed down from mother to daughter. The process wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Every village had at least one dedicated alewife, and she had power. Not noblewoman power, but the kind that meant people actually listened when she said the ale wasn't ready yet. You settle onto a bench beside a lanky man eating what might be a boiled egg, or might be a fistful of mashed beans shaped like an egg. Hard to say. You pull out your crust of bread, tear off a chunk and dip it into your mug of warm ale. It's thin and slightly sour, but it has body, grain suspended in the liquid like a stew that gave up on solids. It washes down the bread, softening it just enough that you don't lose a tooth. Breakfast of survivors. This ale isn't strong, it's what people now call small beer. Barely alcoholic, enough to keep you hydrated, not enough to make you wobble. Kids drink it, the elderly drink it, you drink it. The only thing you don't do is question it. Because the alternative is drinking from the village well, which has been suspiciously green since midsummer. Now for your quirky tidbit. Ale was sometimes brewed with Groot instead of hops, a mix of herbs like yarrow, horehound and mugwort. Mugwort. Sounds made up, right? But it's real, and it gave the drink an herby, almost minty kick. It also had mild hallucinogenic properties, which meant breakfast could turn into a spiritual journey if the batch was strong. Imagine trying to plough a field while high on mugwort. Medieval multitasking at its finest. Of course, not everyone was happy with the alewives' success. Some were accused of watering down their batches, overcharging, or using strange additives. The church had opinions, as always, and authorities often tried to regulate the strength and price of ale, because nothing says government overreach like a man in robes telling you your brew's too hoppy. But despite this, alewives persisted. They fed their families, made money, and kept the village hydrated. There's scholarly debate about how nutritional this ale really was. Some argue it provided essential calories and B vitamins, helping peasants get through grueling labour days. Others say it was more symbolic comfort than real sustenance, especially if watered down or rushed through fermentation. But everyone agrees on one thing: it was safer than the water, and when food was scarce, ale was a lifeline. You take another sip, then slurp up the last of your softened bread. It sits warm in your stomach, a calm in the middle of your otherwise chaotic morning. You look around at the others, men, women, even a young boy clinging to a wooden mug half his size, and realise that this alehouse, humble as it is one of the few places in the village where people gather, share news, or just breathe without worrying about wolves or taxes, or whether your turnip crop has root rot again. The alewife bangs a ladle on the side of the vat, shouting that today's second brew is almost ready. Stronger stuff meant for those with coins to spare. You, naturally, do not have coins, but you offer to carry firewood in exchange for a refill later, and she nods without looking up. Barter accepted. You step out into the daylight, stomach pleasantly warm, head clear, and breath reeking of grain and yeast. It's not glamorous, but it's honest, and for a brief golden moment it's enough. You walk back to your hovel with a little more spring in your step, not because life's easy, but because you've had your ale, chewed your crust, and made a deal with the one woman in town who could poison you and get away with it. You can smell the fish before you see it, a thick, briny stink that clings to your nose hairs and reminds you of the time you found that dead frog behind the water barrel in summer. But this smell means dinner. Possibly breakfast and lunch too if you're strategic about it. It's Friday, which means meat is off the table, even if you had any to begin with. The church says no, so you pivot, you adapt, you go fish. You're standing by the slow-moving stream at the edge of the village, holding a wicker basket that's already falling apart. The water's murky, swirling with silt and secrets, but if you're patient and lucky, or just better at lying to yourself, you'll snag something. Eel if you're blessed, a water beetle if you're cursed. For now, you prod the mud near the reeds with a stick, trying to flush something out. Your stomach growls, a dramatic protest from someone who's been promised herring, and is likely getting pond scum. Fish was technically legal food on fast days, which is how the church classified roughly half the year. No meat on Fridays, or Wednesdays, or during Lent, or Advent. Or, on any day ending in Y, if the priest was in a bad mood. But fish? Fish got a pass. If it came from the water, it was spiritual enough to consume without risking your immortal soul. The logic: fish didn't bleed the same way land animals did, and Jesus liked fishermen. So here you are, cold, wet, and elbow deep in the mud, trying to catch a meal that won't count as sin. You catch a flash of movement under a rock and scoop fast. Your basket comes up heavy with muck and one small wriggling eel. Victory. Slippery, slimy victory. You drop it into a bucket and whisper an apology you don't mean. Eel's not bad. It's chewy, kind of oily, and tastes like fish tried to be meat but lost the argument halfway through. You'll boil it later with vinegar and maybe some leeks, and if the skin peels off easily, you'll know it's cooked enough not to cause hallucinations. If you lived closer to the coast, you might have access to salt cod, dried, cured, and flat as regret. Or herring, packed in barrels and shipped across Europe like slightly fishy bricks. Pickled herring was cheap and therefore ubiquitous. Every peasant from Norway to Normandy had at least one traumatic memory involving it. There was even a joke about it in the local tavern. What's worse than no dinner? 2-day-old herring in July. For you, though, fishing is a local affair. Streams, ponds, and occasionally the Lord's estate moat if you're feeling bold and nimble. That's where the good fish hide, fat trout and the occasional pike, but it's also where the estate steward walks his dog, and that dog once bit someone so hard their hat turned inside out. Let's pause for your historical anchor. The medieval obsession with fish was driven mostly by religious fasting requirements. These weren't suggestions, they were rigid rules, often enforced with social shame or actual penance. Wealthy folks got around it with exotic fish. Sturgeon, dolphin, yes, really. Even beaver tails, which were classified as aquatic. You've got your eel, maybe a handful of minnows if the gods smile on you. And no one's inventing fish fingers for another 700 years. Quirky fact. In some regions, frogs were declared acceptable fish by bishops who really just wanted people to stop eating squirrels. Beaver tail, as mentioned, was fair game too, because it's flat and scaly and swims sometimes. That's right, medieval theology basically looked at the beaver and said, close enough. There's debate, even among medieval scholars, about just how closely the peasant class followed fasting rules. Some argue that rural communities were deeply religious and kept the rules to the letter. Others suggest that people were far too busy trying not to starve to worry about church dietary restrictions. It's likely that adherence varied. Some took it seriously, others found loopholes, and some just said, God will understand, before gnawing on a stolen chicken thigh. Back to you, your eel is still thrashing in the bucket, and you've caught 2 small perch that look more like fish-shaped rumours. It's not much, but it'll stretch. You walk back toward your hut, slipping on the muddy path and cursing whatever saint is supposed to be watching over fishing. At home, you gut the eel with a knife so dull it feels more like negotiation than butchery. The fish are descaled with a spoon, which takes forever and covers you in tiny silver flecks that make you smell like low tide. You drop everything into a pot of water with a splash of vinegar, 1 bruised onion, and some wilted greens. It simmers into a cloudy broth with slick ribbons of oil on top. The eel curls as it cooks, eventually going soft enough to cut with the edge of a spoon. You taste it. It's earthy, a little bitter. But it's warm, and it doesn't make your throat itch, so you call it success. The younger kids slurp it down fast, barely noticing the bones. You chew slowly, tongue flicking away the little ones. There's always one that tries to slide into your throat like a prank. You once heard of a man who choked to death on a fish bone right in the middle of Mass. Now his ghost supposedly haunts the choir stalls. You don't want that to be your legacy, so you chew carefully. You finish with a cup of small ale, washing the taste of river out of your mouth. You lean back, stomach full enough to silence the complaints, and glance at the pot, enough left for breakfast maybe. Or for that one neighbour who always visits right around mealtime, pretending to ask about your goat while eyeing your bowl. Another Friday survived. No meat, no sin, just a handful of fish, a few bones, and the satisfaction of outsmarting the church by cooking a creature that looked like a damp sock. You're standing in your hut, holding something that used to be an animal, or at least part of one. It's pale, rubbery, and veined with what looks suspiciously like cartilage. This, according to your neighbour, is tripe, cow stomach, cleaned more or less, depending on who you ask. It wobbles in your hand like it's trying to escape, and if your nose is to be believed, it might have already started rotting in protest. You take a breath, steel yourself, and drop it into the pot with the handful of chopped cabbage you managed to wrangle from the garden. Welcome to one of the most reliable peasant meals outside of gruel, cabbage, and guts. This dish isn't for the squeamish or indulge, but then again nothing in your life is. You're poor. You can't afford to turn your nose up at organ meat. If someone gives you animal parts, you don't ask which ones. You ask how soon you need to cook them before they grow fur again. Today's lucky find came from the village butcher, who tossed you a bundle of offal because you helped him sweep out his stall. A good deal, you think, until the smell starts rising from the pot. Tripe takes forever to soften. Hours sometimes. You keep it at a slow simmer to keep the pot from boiling dry, stirring occasionally with a stick you used earlier to chase the dog out of the cabbage patch. The trick is patience, and cabbage. Lots of cabbage. It soaks up the smell, stretches the meal, and pretends to be flavour. You throw in some onion, a pinch of salt, and a cracked bit of bone you've been saving for days. It still smells like regret, but now it's hot regret. That's progress. Cabbage, for all its simplicity, is the unsung hero of medieval diets. It's cheap, hardy, and grows even when the soil seems to hate you. You eat it raw in spring, boiled in summer, pickled in autumn, and half-rotten in winter. It's not glamorous, but it gets the job done. Some people even use cabbage leaves as poultices for wounds, because in this era everything has to be edible and medicinal, even your socks. Historically, peasants relied heavily on offal, organ meats, intestines, lungs, kidneys, livers, tongues, brains. Basically, anything the wealthier classes turned their noses up at. It wasn't because they preferred it, it was because they had no choice. The better cuts went to the Lord's table. What was left trickled down the social ladder until you got a knuckle, a liver, and a pig's ear if you were lucky. With enough boiling and cabbage, you could make it taste like food. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In some regions, people made something called black pudding, a sausage made from blood, fat, barley and herbs. Sounds rough, right? But it was packed with iron and actually considered a treat. They'd stuff it into intestines, boil it and slice it cold. Today you're not that lucky. Today it's just boiled guts and cruciferous vegetables. Now, if you're wondering how anyone stomached this, well, that's the scholarly debate. Some argue that medieval people simply had different taste expectations, less focused on flavour, more on fullness. Others say hunger dulled every sense except survival. If it didn't kill you and it didn't smell too much like feet, it was a good meal. Also, slow cooking helped break down tough textures and masked any hint of decomposition, which, let's be honest, was probably always lurking around the corner. You stir the pot again, the tripe has softened slightly, the cabbage is wilted, and the whole thing has turned into a greyish-green sludge. It's not winning any beauty contests, but it's bubbling in a promising way. You ladle out a bowl, steam curling up around your face, and brace yourself. The first bite is chewy. Too chewy. You chew until your jaw starts protesting, then swallow quickly with a chaser of weak ale. The cabbage helps. You pretend it's stew. You lie to yourself. That's part of the process. The others crowd around, bowls in hand, eager, or at least willing. No one complains. No one compliments you either. It's food. It's hot. It counts. The youngest eats quickly, wiping their mouth with a sleeve. One of the older kids pokes at a piece of tripe with a spoon like it might spring back to life. You give them a look. They eat it anyway. Afterward, you lean back and pat your stomach. It's full. Not satisfied, but full. That's enough for now. You cover the pot and let it sit by the fire for tomorrow. Guts always taste better on day 2. More tender, less alarming. You might even add some barley tomorrow if you can spare it. That would be a real upgrade. Outside, the air is sharp with the bite of coming frost. Winter's creeping in, and meals like this will soon be the best you can hope for. You remember last year, when the stew pot held nothing but cabbage for a week straight? You swore you'd never eat it again. But here you are, chewing tripe with a side of boiled leaves, and honestly, it's not the worst thing you've eaten. There's something oddly comforting about it. The sameness, the slowness, the way the pot sits like a hearth guardian, always waiting to be filled with whatever you can scavenge. Meals are never fancy, rarely delicious, but they're yours. You made this. You survived another day. The dog sneaks in as the fire dims. You toss him the rubberiest bit of tripe, which he devours like it's roast goose. He wags his tail and licks his chops. Maybe he knows something you don't. Maybe this is what happiness looks like in the middle of a hard century. Shared warmth, hot guts, and a quiet house. The pot is still warm from last night's guts and greens experiment, and you're back at it. Standing over the hearth, poking at what has now transformed into a thick, bubbling mush. This isn't leftovers. This is dinner reimagined, reincarnated. It's called pottage, and if you had to define your entire existence in one meal, this would be it. Not because it's delicious, not because it's nourishing, but because it never dies. Pottage isn't really a recipe. It's more of an edible concept. You throw things into a pot, you add water, you simmer for hours, and if the end result is vaguely chewable, you eat it. There's no right way, no wrong way, just a spectrum that ranges from this might be stew to this is definitely livestock feed. You stir the pot slowly with your trusty wooden spoon, which has been used so often it's now more seasoning than utensil. Every scrape releases a new scent. Turnip, barley, a hint of smoke, and something vaguely metallic that might be yesterday's knife blade shedding itself into the broth. This morning you added more barley to stretch the meal. Barley is your best friend and your worst enemy. It's nutritious, filling and cheap, but it takes forever to cook and always leaves you feeling like you swallowed a warm brick. Alongside that, you tossed in a wilted carrot, 2 bruised leeks, and the remainder of the boiled tripe, which has gone from rubbery to, well, something else. You don't ask too many questions, you just keep stirring. You glance out the door and see your neighbour trudging by with a sack of wild onions slung over her back. She waves and mouths the universal village phrase, "Still boiling?" You nod and raise your spoon like a flag of surrender. Pottage isn't just a dish, it's an economy. People trade ingredients, swap scraps, borrow each other's pots. Sometimes you'll be halfway through cooking when someone knocks at the door with a handful of beans and a hopeful expression. You make room. You always make room. Food is shared not because you're generous, but because everyone's one bad harvest away from hunger, and no one forgets who gave them a spoonful when their pot was empty. Historically, pottage was the medieval staple, the backbone of the peasant diet, rich in fibre, modest in protein, and endlessly adjustable depending on the season. You could toss in cabbage, leeks, wild herbs, leftover grains, and even tiny pieces of meat or fat if you were blessed by the butcher or just sneaky with your traps. It was cooked slowly over open flames and reheated repeatedly, sometimes for days on end. Some pots barely cooled between meals. In a sense, your pottage isn't just food, it's a timeline. Quirky fact, in some places, this never-ending stew became a kind of family heirloom. There are records of medieval households maintaining a perpetual pottage, which they kept on simmering for weeks, even months, adding to it daily. You can imagine the flavour, complex, ancient, slightly terrifying. But for many, it was both meal and ritual, proof that something in their world was still going, even if the pigs weren't. Of course, scholars argue about just how widespread this practice really was. Some say most peasants simply couldn't afford to keep a fire going day and night and would instead reheat their stews when needed. Others suggest the communal nature of village life made the idea more plausible. Shared fire, shared food, shared burden. Either way, the concept sticks. Pottage was never just about eating. It was about enduring. You finally ladle out a portion into a cracked bowl. It's thick, almost like glue, and steams as you blow on it. The flavour hits you in stages, salty, earthy, slightly sour, then strangely sweet from the caramelised leeks. Not bad, not good, just there, which, again, is enough. You hand out the rest of the portions. Everyone eats in silence, chewing slowly, occasionally pausing to pick out a barley husk or a piece of what you sincerely hope was turnip. The youngest child, still learning how to chew without crying, slurps his pottage with alarming enthusiasm. You wonder what it must be like to grow up thinking this is just how food works. Hot grey sludge for every meal. Will he remember the taste when he's older? Will he crave it, the way people later on crave comfort food that reminded them of home? Or will he flee the first chance he gets and never look back at a pot again? Outside, the wind picks up, rustling the thatch overhead and whistling through the cracks in the door. You tuck the pot closer to the coals, keeping it warm for supper, and wipe your hands on your apron, or what's left of it after months of abuse. There's something almost comforting about it now, this bubbling sludge, this brown lifeline, this meal that never truly ends. It's the rhythm of your life. Gather, boil, eat, repeat. Later, as the sun begins to sink and the sky turns that familiar muddy gold, you toss in a few more greens you found behind the house, dock leaves, some beetroot stems, and a single mushroom that may or may not be edible. You sniff it, shrug, into the pot it goes. Tomorrow this same stew will taste different. Not better, not worse, just different. That's the magic of pottage. It's always changing, always surviving just like you. You sit back, legs stretched out toward the hearth, spoon resting across your lap like a badge of weary honour. You've eaten worse, and you've been hungrier. And as long as the pot keeps boiling, you've got a future. You open the pot again, not because you're hungry, though you are, but because it's habit. The pottage has thickened into something between wallpaper paste and clay, and it lets out a low glorp when you stir it. Bits of barley cling to the sides like they're trying to escape. There's still a faint smell of yesterday's tripe, now dulled by time and repeated boiling. You sigh. Dinner again, or maybe lunch. Honestly, it's all starting to blur together. But here's the truth. This isn't just what you eat. It's what you keep eating, over and over, until every bowl starts to taste like the same chewable memory. There's no such thing as leftovers in your world. That would imply there was ever a main meal to begin with. You don't throw anything away, not because you're noble, but because waste is a luxury. You save the bones, scrape the crust from the bottom of the pot and spoon out the last bit of mash even when it's dry and burned. Especially when it's dry and burned. That's the good part. That's where the flavour lives. Today's addition to the pottage is a stale crust of bread you found hiding behind the salt jar. It's rock hard, but when soaked and boiled it softens into a sort of gummy slab. You tear it up and toss it in, watching it disappear beneath the surface like it was never bread to begin with. This is medieval recycling at its finest. If a food item still vaguely resembles food and hasn't developed its own ecosystem, it gets reused. You reach up into the rafter net and bring down a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside is a cracked bowl holding the remnants of a broth from 2 nights ago, mainly fat, some floating bits, and what might be half a lentil. You scrape it into the pot with a splash of water and a firm stir. Now it's dinner. Again. Historically, food waste was almost non-existent in the medieval peasant household. Everything had a second life. Bread crusts became thickeners. Bones were boiled and reboiled until they splintered like chalk. If meat was ever part of the meal, and that was rare, it got carved, stripped, stewed, and then the fat saved in jars or smeared onto crusts. Even vegetable peels, if clean enough, were thrown into stews. If not, they went to the pigs, and if you didn't have pigs, you probably had a dog, and if you didn't have either, you were the pig and the dog. You cut off a piece of cheese, or what used to be cheese. It's hard, sharp, and covered in a powdery bloom of mould which you brush off without thinking. You shave a few slivers into the pottage. Instantly it smells better. The mould was probably penicillin adjacent. Maybe you've accidentally invented the cure for something. Or maybe it's just old cheese doing its best. Here's your quirky fact. In some areas, people saved the crusty residue from the bottom of stew pots, called scrapings or leavings, and deliberately mixed it into the next batch of food. It was believed to enhance flavour, especially since seasoning was rare and usually expensive. Your ancestors basically invented the stock cube, using grime, not glamorous, but undeniably efficient. And now for the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that this constant reuse of food resulted in diets that were, surprisingly, more nutrient-dense than you'd think. Layers of beans, grains, herbs, and vegetables stacked day after day in an evolving stew. Others push back, pointing to chronic deficiencies, especially during lean seasons when even the reused meals didn't include enough protein, fats, or vitamins. What both sides agree on? People weren't tossing their chicken skins into the trash and ordering something new. You ladle out another portion and notice something new at the bottom. One perfect bean. Just one. Where it came from is anyone's guess. Maybe it was hiding. Maybe it floated in with the neighbour's contribution. You fish it out, hold it up like it's a pearl and pop it in your mouth. Soft, salty, almost good. Later in the day, someone knocks at your door. It's a cousin or a cousin's cousin, it hardly matters, and they're holding out a small bowl. The look in their eyes says, "Please tell me your pot is still warm." You nod and spoon out a ladleful, careful to leave them a little barley, and something that vaguely resembles flavour. They nod their thanks, take a bite on the doorstep and smile. Not because it's tasty, because it's hot. You sit back down and stretch your legs. The pot keeps bubbling, low and steady. It's not just food anymore, it's part of the furniture, a companion. You check the logs, still a few left, and throw one into the hearth. The flames jump, casting flickering shadows along the blackened walls. The pottage thickens again, reshaping itself into something new that's also incredibly old. You wonder what it would be like to walk into a house with a new meal, something with a smell that doesn't whisper 3 days ago. But that's not your life. Your life is this pot, this stew, this endless cycle of reheating, reusing, reimagining. And honestly, it works. You're not sick. You're not hungry, at least not right now. And tomorrow this same pot will greet you again. A little older, a little thicker, a little closer to immortality. Outside, the stars begin to wink through the smoke-streaked sky. Inside, you give the pot one last stir and let it rest. You're not done with it. And it's certainly not done with you. You're sitting cross-legged by the fire, holding a small crumbly chunk of what your grandmother called cheese. Or at least that's what it once was before time, smoke and mould turned it into something else entirely. The rind is cracked, speckled with patches of blue and green, and smells faintly of old socks left too long in the sun. You break off a sliver with your thumbnail and pop it into your mouth. bracing for the sharp tang that always follows. Somehow, despite its appearance, this bit of aged curd is survival gold. Protein-packed, calorie-dense, and oddly comforting in a way that nothing else in your pantry can match. Cheese in their medieval peasant diet wasn't fancy. Forget soft, creamy bries or aged goudas. You got what was cheap, local and easy to store. Hard, crumbly cheeses made from sheep or goat's milk were the norm, less milk duct to go around and a natural preservative in the salt and rind. The stuff was often homemade, churned by women whose hands smelled of hay and patience, and left to mature in cool cellars or packed in straw baskets. Sometimes it was mixed with herbs or ashes to keep pests at bay, giving it a smoky, earthy undertone you either loved or learned to tolerate. The storage was crucial. Without refrigeration, cheese was either eaten fresh or left to age, becoming drier and harder, but lasting longer. In some places, cheese was traded like currency. A small wheel could be swapped for eggs, a handful of beans, or even a day's worth of labour. For you, a wedge of cheese means you might skip a meagre meal or stretch a pot of pottage just a little further. A quirky fact: medieval cheese often came with bonus mould cultures, some of which modern science has found contain natural antibiotics, early accidental penicillin. So that funky rind you've been picking at? It might just be helping keep you healthy, or at least not making you worse. There's a debate among historians about the role of cheese in the peasant diet. Some argue that it was a vital source of protein and fat that helped balance out a diet, otherwise heavy in carbohydrates and fibre. Others point out that many peasants couldn't afford milk products regularly, relying mostly on grains and vegetables. Access depended a lot on geography and social standing, even among the poor. If you lived near sheep pastures, you were luckier than those stuck with only a handful of cows or goats, whose milk was mostly reserved for calves. You chew slowly, savouring the tang and the grit, and dip your bit of cheese into the last of the barley pottage. It softens the crumbly texture and adds a salty richness that brings the whole meal together. You offer a piece to your neighbour, who accepts it gratefully, their eyes brightening for a moment. This simple exchange feels like a feast compared to the usual grind. You look around the room, rough wooden walls, a tattered weird blanket draped over a corner bench, a clay pot simmering softly, and realise how much your survival depends on these small miracles. A wedge of cheese, a crust of bread, a bowl of pottage thickened with scraps. None of it glamorous, none of it new, but all of it crucial. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, and the smoke from the hearth curls up into the twilight. You bite down on another sliver of cheese, knowing tomorrow you'll need every crumb, every calorie, every bit of grit and flavour to keep going. For tonight, this is enough. It's feast day, but not for you. The village square bustles with life, music, dancing, and the smell of roasting meat wafting through the air like a cruel joke. You stand on the outskirts, clutching your empty bowl, watching as nobles and clergy parade past in their finery, their plates piled high with juicy roasts and sweet cakes dripping pang with honey. For the likes of you, feast days mean scraps, if you're lucky. Maybe a bone thrown down, maybe a morsel left forgotten on a bench. Today, you're hoping the monks feel generous. Feast days were a mixed blessing for peasants. On one hand, they marked rare occasions when the Lord's generosity, or at least his appetite, might trickle down to the common folk. On the other, they were reminders of how far removed your life was from the gilded halls and silver platters. Saints' days, harvest festivals and religious holidays meant special food, but mostly for the elite and clergy. For the poor, it was often a day of watching others eat. Monasteries played a unique role here. They cultivated their own gardens, kept livestock, and baked bread in ways peasants could only dream of. On feast days, monks sometimes shared leftovers or distributed bread to the needy. You remember last year when the abbot tossed down a loaf that was so dense and crusty you nearly broke a tooth. But you ate it anyway. Each bite was a quiet victory. A quirky fact: the term feast doesn't always mean what you think. In many places, feasts were more about the quantity and quality of bread and ale than meat. Even nobles often ate a diet surprisingly heavy on bread, cheese and fish. Meat was reserved for the highest classes or special occasions. Yet the poor counted on these days for any extra calories they could scrounge. Historically, feast days were embedded in the agricultural calendar and religious observance. They offered rhythm to peasant life, breaks in the endless toil and moments of communal celebration. But scholars debate how often peasants really benefited materially from these days. Some suggest the celebrations mostly reinforced social hierarchies, while others believe they provided crucial relief in the form of food and community. You catch a glimpse of the village alewife weaving through the crowd, balancing a basket of small, crusty loaves, her contribution to the feast. You step forward cautiously, hoping for a piece. She hands you one without a word, eyes twinkling. The bread is dense, rye-heavy, and smells faintly of smoke. You clutch it like treasure. You find a quiet corner and tear off a hunk, nibbling slowly. The crust is thick and slightly bitter, the crumb coarse but satisfying. It's not the roast lamb or honeyed cakes you see at the tables, but it fills a hole in your belly like no other meal can. For a moment you imagine what it would be like to sit at a banquet, to eat without counting bites. As you chew, you hear a soft chant rising from the nearby chapel. The monks are singing. The sound is pure and steady, a comforting backdrop to the feast's chaos. You close your eyes and let the melody wash over you, grateful for the small kindnesses amid hardship. The loaf dwindles in your hands, crumbs falling to the dirt. You tuck the last piece into your pocket, for later, if you're lucky. Feast day might be over soon, but for you the struggle continues. Tomorrow you'll return to pottage and stale bread, to the same pot and the same fire. But tonight, for a few brief hours, you tasted something more. You awake to the gentle sound of birdsong outside your window and the faint scent of herbs drying in the chilly morning air. Today you find yourself wandering toward the monastery garden, a rare patch of green in the otherwise muddy village. The monks tend this garden with near-religious fervour, growing rows of herbs, vegetables, and fruit that seem almost magical compared to the tough weeds in your own patch. You step carefully between the raised beds, grateful for the patchwork of colour and life. The monks grow all sorts of useful things: rosemary, sage, thyme and lavender for flavour and medicine, leeks and onions for stew, and root vegetables that hold up well in winter. This garden isn't just a place to grow food, it's a place of healing. The monks sell or distribute these herbs to the poor, teaching them which leaves soothe aches and which roots ward off fevers. They act as gardeners, pharmacists, and sometimes the only healthcare many villagers ever see. You pick a sprig of mint, inhaling its cool, sharp scent. It's a tiny luxury, one you'll save for tea, or to flavour a particularly bleak bowl of pottage. You gather a handful of nettles, after carefully crushing the stinging hairs to release their nutritional goodness, and tuck them into your basket. Nettles are surprisingly rich in iron and vitamins, but you have to be brave to eat them. When boiled, they lose their bite and taste like a mild spinach, which you consider a victory. The garden paths are muddy, and the wooden fences creak in the wind. You hear footsteps and turn to see Brother Thomas approaching, his robes dusty and hands full of parsley and chamomile. He nods at you kindly and offers a small bundle of dried herbs, explaining they can be brewed into a tea that eases digestion and calms nerves. You accept gratefully, knowing every little remedy counts when you're living hand to mouth. Historically, monastery gardens were vital not only for the monks' own sustenance, but also as centres of knowledge and charity. Monks preserved ancient herbal wisdom from classical texts and their own experimentation. Their gardens supplied both food and medicine, helping to ease the suffering of surrounding communities. In many ways, they were the medieval version of a health clinic and farmer's market rolled into one. Here's your quirky fact. Monks sometimes grew flying herbs, plants like wormwood and rue, believed to ward off evil spirits and protect crops from bad luck. Superstition mixed with botany, and it all found its way into daily life and the stew pot. Imagine adding a dash of magical herbs to your pottage, because you thought it might keep witches at bay. The line between food, medicine and magic was delightfully blurry. Scholars debate how much access peasants really had to monastic gardens. Some argue that monasteries shared freely and generously, especially in times of famine or plague. Others suggest access was limited, controlled by rigid social rules, and that the poor often scavenged leftover scraps rather than fresh harvests. It likely varied widely depending on local customs and the temperament of the monks. You tuck your herbs carefully into your bag and start the slow walk home, the basket feeling a little heavier and your steps a little lighter. Back at your hut, these simple greens will transform your pottage, adding colour, flavour and a touch of hope to the daily grind. It's not much, but it's enough to keep you moving forward, one simmering pot at a time. The morning sun barely peeks over the horizon when you're already out in the fields, shoulders stooped beneath the weight of your grain sack. Today's the day the tax collector comes, the man who's more feared than the wolves and twice as relentless. Half your barley, rye or oats end up in his hands. It's the law, The tithe, the toll, the necessary evil that keeps the Lord's manor running and your belly just barely full enough to keep working. It's the kind of robbery that wears a cloak of legitimacy. You lay your sack on the rough wooden scales in front of the manor house, hands trembling. The collector's eyes scan the grain with practiced suspicion, searching for signs of cheating, grit mixed in, stones hidden beneath the kernels, or just plain old skimming off the top. You've heard stories of peasants being forced to kneel in the cold while the Lord's men rifled through their belongings, confiscating more than what was owed. Today, you pray for mercy. The grain you gave up wasn't just food. It was your future bread, your weekly pottage fuel, the hope of a loaf or two to last the winter. Giving it away feels like a slow starvation, a tax on survival itself. You return home lighter, stomach tightening with dread. The sack you keep isn't heavy enough to stave off hunger, but it's all you have. Historically, tithes and taxes were a crushing burden on medieval peasants. They were legally required to surrender a tenth of their produce to the church, the Lord, or both. The system was complicated, often unfair, and ripe for exploitation. Lords would sometimes demand more than the legal tithe, especially in hard years, turning subsistence into desperation. Peasants were stuck between their survival and their obligations, caught in a relentless cycle. A quirky fact: some peasants tried to hide grain by mixing it with chaff or even grinding it coarsely to cheat the scales. Risky, but sometimes worth it. Others resorted to burying sacks in the fields or passing grain secretly among neighbours. The best trick: using dry measure containers instead of wet ones, as moisture could weigh down the grain and cost you extra. It was a low-stakes war of wits every harvest. The scholarly debate centres on how much these taxes contributed to medieval famines and unrest. Some argue that oppressive taxation significantly weakened peasant communities, making them vulnerable to starvation when harvests failed. Others claim that poor weather and crop failures were the main culprits, with taxes exacerbating but not causing crises. Either way, it's clear that taxes turned every meal into a gamble. Back at your hut, you weigh your remaining grain carefully. Every kernel counts. You know that this year you'll need to stretch it further than ever. You think about the pottage pot simmering on the hearth and how it will have to do more heavy lifting to fill the gap left by the tithe. There's no room for waste, no margin for error. You sit down with a crust of bread and a cup of small beer, feeling the dull ache of hunger sharpen in your belly. It's a bitter taste, this giving up of your food to fill someone else's larder. Yet you remind yourself that it's a part of the world you live in. A world where survival is measured in handfuls of grain and not moments of comfort. Outside, the village moves on, farmers tending to their fields and children chasing chickens. The tax collector's wagon rumbles away, heavier than when it arrived, and you watch until it disappears behind the hills. Tomorrow you'll return to your pot, your bread, and your endless work, because what else is there? The sky is low and grey, the kind of day that promises rain and delivers mud. Word has spread through the village like wildfire. The harvest is poor this year. The grain you counted on, the barley you saved, the rye you carefully ground, it's all less than last season, maybe half as much. Hunger creeps in like an unwelcome guest, settling in your bones and making the work in the fields feel heavier than usual. You can taste the coming famine, bitter and metallic on your tongue. The village is restless. People whisper in hushed tones about the grain stores being too low, about the breadline growing longer. A few neighbours are already fighting over scraps, pushing, shouting, accusing one another of hoarding. You watch from a distance, stomach twisting as you clutch your own small sack. The miller's wheel turns slower these days, the grain running thin, and everyone knows it's only a matter of time before the pottage pot runs dry. Historically, grain shortages triggered riots across medieval Europe. Bread was life, and when bread was scarce, people fought. Some cities locked their gates against hungry mobs. Others saw peasants storming granaries, desperate to survive. These grain riots weren't just about food. They were protests against a system that seemed designed to keep the poor starving and the rich fed. Bread was a right, not a privilege. At least that's how many saw it. A quirky fact: some communities resorted to eating acorns, which required leaching out bitter tannins before they could be safely consumed. People made acorn flour, though it was a poor substitute, bitter and hard on the teeth. In worse times, people even ate boiled leather, yes, leather, when all else failed. This wasn't folklore, it's grim reality. Scholars debate the scale and frequency of medieval famines. Some say they were localised, triggered by bad weather or crop failure. while others argue they were systemic, tied to social inequality and poor harvest management. There's also disagreement about how effective medieval governments were at relief. Some point to charity and grain redistribution, while others highlight neglect and corruption. Back in your hut, you stare at your dwindling grain stash and calculate how to make it last. You consider cutting portions even smaller, boiling pottage longer to stretch the volume. You think about the wild plants you might forage, the nettles and dandelions that will soon be your only greens. The thought is grim, but it's survival. Hunger is a constant companion, and you've learned not to trust the fullness of any meal. You hear a distant shout. Someone's arguing near the granary. You don't want to get involved. The tension is thick, like the fog rolling in from the fields. You pull your coat tighter and return to your hearth, where the fire sputters weakly. The pot bubbles with a thin, watery pottage, nothing like the hearty stew you dreamed of. But it's something. It's hope. You sit and eat quietly, knowing that tomorrow you'll need to do the same, and the day after that. Because in a bad harvest year, every mouthful is a battle, and every meal is a victory. You're out at dawn, weaving your way through the brambles and thorn bushes just beyond the village boundaries, basket in hand and heart pounding. Foraging is the name of the game today, because when the larder's bare and the fields have been picked clean, wild plants are your only hope. Nettles, wild onions, dandelion greens. They're bitter, tasty, tough, and sometimes sting when you handle them, but they're edible. You know their names, their seasons, and the spots where they grow best. You've been learning from your mother, your grandmother, and the old woman who always smells faintly of vinegar and mischief. But you're not alone. The Lord's gamekeeper patrols these lands like a hawk, watching for peasants sneaking into the forest to grab what isn't theirs. Poaching game, deer, rabbits, birds, is a crime punishable by flogging or worse. Foraging for plants, while less risky, can still land you in trouble if you wander too close to the manor's private woods. You stick to the edges, eyes sharp, ears straining for footsteps or barking dogs. Every snap of a twig sends a jolt through your spine. Historically, foraging was a vital supplement to the peasant diet, especially in lean times. People collected wild herbs, roots, berries, and nuts, not just to fill their bellies, but also to add flavour and nutrition to their otherwise monotonous meals. However, the right to gather was often limited by strict forest laws. Lords jealously guarded their hunting grounds, and villagers could be harshly punished for trespassing. The forest was a source of life and danger, a place of both sustenance and fear. A quirky fact, some medieval foragers collected not only plants but also insects like grasshoppers and beetles. While not a preferred source of protein, these edible bugs occasionally made it into stews or were roasted as snacks during desperate times. Not exactly haute cuisine, but survival calls for creativity. The scholarly debate revolves around the extent and impact of forest laws on rural populations. Some historians argue these laws severely restricted access, contributing to poverty and food insecurity. Others suggest local customs and agreements often allowed peasants more freedom than official records imply. Either way, the tension between survival and authority shaped daily life. You crouch near a cluster of wild garlic, its bright green leaves waving in the cool breeze. You snap a few stalks and add them to your basket, the pungent smell filling your nostrils. It's a small victory, but every bit counts. You also pick a handful of wood sorrel, tart and lemony, which you know will brighten your next meal. On your way back, you pause at a bramble bush heavy with dark, slightly shriveled blackberries. You eat a few despite their sourness, savouring the fleeting sweetness. The forest gives, but never freely. As you approach the village, you hear distant shouts, likely the gamekeeper warning off other foragers, or scolding a group of children for wandering too far. You quicken your pace, heart still racing, clutching your modest haul like a treasure. Back at your hut, you rinse the plants in cold water, bruising the nettles just enough to tame their sting. You add the wild greens to the pottage simmering over the fire, the aroma shifting from dull to sharp and fresh. It's not a feast, but it's a taste of freedom, a reminder that even in hardship the wild world offers small mercies. You sit by the fire and eat slowly, savouring the bitterness of the greens mingling with the familiar grains. Tonight the forest has fed you, and for now, that's enough. You stare into the smoky haze of your kitchen, eyeing the small mound of salted meat hanging from a hook near the rafters. Salt, smoke and pickling, the medieval trifecta for preserving food. Without them, your scant rations would rot in days. and winter would turn your larder into a graveyard of mould and maggots. Tonight, you're dusting off the old knowledge of preservation, because what you don't eat now, you need to make last through the frost. Salt is precious, not the fancy kind that shines white and sparkles like snow, but coarse rock salt mined from deep caverns or scraped from sea brine. You use it sparingly, rubbing it into cuts of meat or fish to draw out moisture and keep the bacteria at bay. The salt dries the surface, creating a barrier that turns juicy flesh into hard, salty, jerky-like slabs. These hang in the smokehouse, a small lean-to, near the hearth where the air smells of pine and burning bark. The smoke infuses the meat with flavour and keeps flies away. You've learned to recognise the difference between good smoke and the kind that tastes like a campfire disaster. Pickling is your friend too. Cabbage, turnips, onions. They're chopped and packed tightly in barrels with salt and water, where natural fermentation creates lactic acid, preserving the vegetables and giving them a tangy kick. Pickled foods add vital vitamins to your diet when fresh produce is scarce. You remember the last batch of sauerkraut you saved through winter. It was sour and sometimes bitter, but it kept scurvy at bay when all else failed. Here's a historical fact. Salt was so valuable in medieval times that it was often called white gold. Entire towns grew wealthy from salt mines, and salt taxes were a significant source of royal income. Poor peasants sometimes traded their last eggs or a day's labour just to buy enough salt to preserve their winter stores. Now, a quirky bit. Did you know that some medieval people preserved meat by burying it in bogs or rivers? The cold, anaerobic environment slowed decay, creating what we might call natural refrigeration. Archaeologists have even found edible meat in peat bogs thousands of years old, though you probably wouldn't want to try it without a fire and a prayer. There's ongoing debate among scholars about how widespread and effective these preservation techniques were among the poor. Some argue that while nobles had cellars, smokehouses, and access to ample salt, peasants often had to make do with far less. Salt shortages, the high cost and limited space meant that many peasants relied heavily on fresh, quickly eaten food, leading to higher rates of spoilage and foodborne illness. You carefully cut a thin slice of salted pork, its edges crusted with smoke and salt crystals. The first bite is chewy, salty and smoky, more flavour than you've had in days. You chew thoughtfully, savouring the richness. It's a rare treat and you make it last, washing it down with a sip of small beer. Your pot bubbles quietly on the hearth, thickened with yesterday's pottage and enriched with a splash of pickle juice. The sourness sharpens the flavour, cutting through the blandness. You ladle out a bowl and share it with the children, watching their eyes brighten as the taste buds awaken. Pickling and smoking don't just keep food safe, they keep hope alive. Outside, the wind whispers through the thatch and the night grows colder. You wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders and think about the long months ahead. Thanks to salt, smoke and pickling, you might just make it through. The chill in the air grows sharper, and you find yourself tightening your belt one notch, not from pride but necessity. Starving in style isn't about glitter or glamour, it's about how creatively you can stretch your dwindling food and still pretend it's a feast. Winter's approach means your larder's thinning, and you're resorting to culinary improvisation that would make even the hardiest monk wince. His belt tightening with a side of desperation, and you're its reluctant chef. You stare at the pot bubbling quietly on the hearth. The pottage is thicker now, more glue than stew, but you've learned to work with what you've got. You add crushed roots you found foraged, a bit of burdock, some wild parsnip, along with dried herbs scavenged from the garden. It's a hodgepodge of flavours, none of which quite complement the others, but somehow simmered together, they make a kind of harmony born of necessity. In years when the harvest failed, the peasant's ingenuity was the difference between survival and death. There were recipes passed down for famine bread, made from acorn meal, ground bark, or dried nettles mixed into whatever flour was available. These weren't treats, they were tributes to desperation, designed to fill the belly with minimal nutrition. Some added ashes or lime to mask the bitterness, but the texture was always gritty and the flavour mournful. Here's a quirky fact. During extreme famine, some peasants reportedly boiled leather, old belts, shoes, even scraps from saddles, to extract whatever nutrients they could. The resulting broth was bitter, tough, and mostly fibre, but it kept them alive. Imagine chewing on your own shoe just to survive winter. That's medieval culinary creativity at its harshest. Historians debate how widespread and frequent such extreme measures were. Some believe these desperate foods were last resorts used only in the worst years, while others argue that poverty was so endemic that many regularly relied on such starving meals. Archaeological evidence of charcoal in bread and fibre in broth suggests that bark bread was indeed common in hard times. Tonight, you add a pinch of ash to the pot, a nod to tradition and necessity, watching the stew darken slightly. You ladle out a thin bowl and take a slow sip. The bitterness is sharp, but it's warmth in a cold world. You eat with the youngest child who watches you carefully, learning what it means to survive when life isn't fair. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters and the fire sputters low. You pull your cloak tighter and remind yourself, this meal might be grim, but it's a meal. It's a promise that you'll see tomorrow. Sometimes surviving is about eating the unpalatable and making peace with hunger's shadow. You smile wryly. Starving in style isn't about fancy dishes. It's about stubbornness, resilience, and a healthy dose of culinary desperation. And you're a master of the art. The miller's stone groans beneath your hands, the rough grain grinding between the wheels like ancient bones rubbing together. You've learnt the hard way that the miller's cut is never fair. Half the flour you grind disappears into his pockets, or worse, into the rats' nests in the rafters. What you get back is gritty, coarse, and often mixed with bits of stone, straw, and the occasional unfortunate insect that met its end between the grinding wheels. Flour is gold dust, and the miller holds the scales. You cradle the sack of freshly ground flour, the smell dusty and faintly sweet, but the texture makes you cringe. This isn't fine white flour, the kind the nobles dream of. It's whole grain, which means every scrap of bran, husk and grit stays in the mix, turning your bread into a dense, lumpy loaf that wears down your teeth. Still, it's better than eating nothing. Grinding grain was back-breaking work, often done at communal mills owned by the lord or the village. The miller's fee, sometimes a tenth or more of the flour, was a legal toll. But like most things, it often stretched into extortion. Peasants grumbled but paid, knowing the alternative was to grind the grain themselves with a quernstone, tedious and inefficient, or risk the lord's wrath. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, millers were rumoured to be tricksters and thieves, accused of stealing flour by adding pebbles to the mix, or running the mill at a slower pace to reduce output. Folk tales abound of clever peasants who outwitted greedy millers, one swapping the miller's water bucket with a leaky one, another grinding grit until the miller's teeth ached. Whether truth or legend, these stories underscore the tension in a trade essential for survival. Scholars debate how much the miller's cut and grain quality affected medieval nutrition. Some argue that the frequent contamination with stones and chaff led to dental problems and digestive issues, which compounded the hardships of poor diets. Others suggest that the coarse, fibrous bread actually provided health benefits by promoting digestion and preventing scurvy. Either way, the quality of flour shaped daily life more than most realise. You knead the dough with gritty hands, the texture tough and uneven. The bread won't rise much, there's no yeast, or if there is, it's a weak starter passed down through generations, more sour than fluffy. You shape it into a thick, flat loaf and set it to bake near the hearth. The heat is uneven, and you check frequently to avoid burning. When it's done, the crust is hard and dark and the crumb dense and chewy. It's the kind of bread you use as a spoon, a plate and a weapon if needed. You slice a piece, bite down and feel the grit crunch between your teeth. It's not pleasant, but it fills your stomach and gives you energy to face another day. You offer a chunk to the youngest, who chews thoughtfully, then smiles, a small victory in a tough world. Outside, the miller's wheel turns steadily, grinding grain for the next batch of loaves. You watch as a crow circles overhead, cawing like a reminder that life goes on, rough and unpolished but still stubbornly present. You rub your fingers together, imagining the mysterious, exotic spice that only the wealthiest can afford. Pepper. For peasants like you, spices are fairy tales whispered by travelling merchants and noble servants. You have heard tales of black pepper imported from faraway lands, fiery and precious, worth more than gold in some parts. But in your world, pepper is a luxury, a symbol of status, and a tantalising tease that lingers just beyond your reach. Medieval Europe had a complicated love affair with spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg were prized not only for flavour, but for their supposed medicinal properties and ability to preserve food. These spices travelled thousands of miles along the Silk Road and through Arabian traders before reaching European markets, which drove their price sky high. Only nobles, merchants, and clergy could afford them, often using them as displays of wealth and power. Quirky fact, pepper was sometimes used as a form of currency, paid as rent or tax to the lord. There's even a medieval phrase, peppercorn rent, which originally meant paying an insignificant amount, like a single peppercorn, as symbolic rent. Imagine trading a single spice kernel for a whole year's tenancy. There's a scholarly debate about how often and how much peasants truly consumed spices. Some historians believe that poor peasants rarely, if ever, tasted these exotic flavours. Others argue that small amounts trickled down through markets and fairs, mixing into communal pots at festivals or special occasions. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Most peasants lived on bland staples, but on rare occasions a pinch of pepper might grace the lord's leftovers or a travelling trader's gift. Your imagination runs wild as you picture a stew bubbling with pepper's warm heat, garlic's pungency, and the sweetness of cinnamon. You wonder what it must be like to eat food that doesn't taste like the same slow-cooked pottage day after day. But your own pot is plain, simmering on the fire with barley, nettles, and a few roots. You pinch a bit of salt into the pot, breathing in the simple aroma. The thought of spices sparks a quiet hope. Maybe one day you'll taste pepper, not just in your imagination but on your tongue. For now, you settle for the familiar smells and flavours of your modest meal, knowing that survival is often about making peace with what you have, not longing for what you don't. Outside, a merchant caravan passes through the village, dust rising in their wake. You watch from the shadows, wondering if any of those precious spices will ever find their way to your humble table. Until then, you eat slowly, savouring the warmth of the fire and the faint hope of something more. You stare down at the iron pot hanging above the hearth, its blackened sides coated with years of soot and seasoning. This pot isn't just cookware, it's your alchemy lab, your life support, and occasionally your culinary curse. In this era, the kitchen isn't a place of gourmet experiments but a battlefield where you negotiate survival with charred crusts and stubborn lumps. Your pot has seen it all: burnt pottages, near-poisonous herbal concoctions, and the occasional miracle stew. You stir slowly, watching the bubbling liquid transform from dull grey to a slightly richer brown. The thick slurry contains yesterday's barley, some wilted greens, a pinch of salt, and a scrap of dried meat that's more chewy than tender. The heat of the iron pot distributes unevenly, creating hot spots that scorch the bottom while leaving the top simmering. This isn't cooking, it's managing chaos. Historically, the iron pot was a medieval kitchen's essential. Made heavy and durable, it could hang over open flames, retain heat for hours, and withstand the occasional overzealous stir. People often used cast iron or wrought iron, which could last decades if cared for properly. However, cooking in iron sometimes leached metallic flavours into food, especially acidic stews. Quirky fact, some medieval cooks believed that cooking in iron had health benefits, from strengthening the blood to warding off evil spirits. Others claimed that iron pots could curse the meal if not blessed or properly cleaned, leading to tales of haunted kitchenware passed down through generations. If your pot ever rattled on its own, superstitious neighbours might have advised sprinkling holy water or garlic around the hearth. Scholars debate the actual impact of iron cookware on medieval diets. While iron pots were durable, some argue that uneven heating and food sticking to the sides meant meals were often burnt or undercooked. Others suggest that the long simmer times helped extract nutrients from tough ingredients, making the most of cheap cuts and wild greens. You ladle out a bowl, steam swirling upward in lazy spirals. The flavour is humble, earthy, salty, slightly metallic, but it fills your belly and warms your bones. You sip slowly, savouring the moment before the routine of the day pulls you away. In this kitchen, every meal is a small victory against hunger and hardship. Your iron pot holds more than food. It holds your resilience, your stories, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow the stew might be just a little better. You duck under a low doorway and into the maze of narrow, filthy streets where the city's poor crowd like cogs in a grinding machine. The tavern is a noisy refuge, a smoky cavern where the air is thick with the smell of stale ale, unwashed bodies, and the occasional waft of burnt meat, or what passes for meat. The tavern keeper eyes you with a mix of suspicion and recognition, knowing you're here not for pleasure, but because your own pot is empty. You find a corner to settle in, dodging the occasional puddle of unknown origin, and prepare for whatever scraps you can scavenge. In the urban slums, food is a battle against scarcity and filth. The poor rely heavily on taverns for cheap meals, which are often just spoiled pies, thin pottages, or dried bread softened with ale. The food isn't fresh and it's rarely safe, but it's easier than scrounging in markets where prices are high and traders wary. You share a corner with men and women who scrape by on odd jobs, leftover morsels and whatever charity trickles down from wealthier patrons. Historically, taverns were centres of social life, but also hubs of food insecurity for the urban poor. Unlike rural peasants, city dwellers couldn't grow their own food, relying instead on markets and alehouses where prices fluctuated wildly. Tavern food was cheap but often spoiled, and outbreaks of food poisoning were common. Despite the risks, taverns offered warmth, community, and a chance to exchange news and gossip. Here's a quirky fact. Some tavern pies were notorious for containing surprise ingredients, anything from offal to spoiled fish, or worse, the phrase eating humble pie literally referred to consuming these low-quality scraps. There are even tales of street vendors mixing sawdust or chalk into bread to stretch supplies, a practice that could cause serious health problems. Scholars debate how much tavern food improved or worsened urban health. Some argue that alehouses helped sustain the poor by providing calories and social networks. Others point to the dangers of contaminated food and alcohol abuse. Still, taverns remained a lifeline, the closest thing to home for many city dwellers. You manage to barter a half-spoiled meat pie for some firewood, and while the pie is greasy and tough, it fills a corner of your empty stomach. You eat slowly, savouring the warmth it brings more than the flavour. Around you, laughter erupts from a nearby table, punctuated by coarse jokes and the clink of mugs. The noise is comforting, a reminder that even in hardship life goes on. You glance out the grimy window and watch the city's shadows lengthen. Tomorrow you'll return to your own pot and your own stew, but for now, this rough tavern meal is enough to keep you going. It's not luxury, but it's survival, and sometimes that's the best you can hope for. The youngest child sits at your side, eyes wide and restless, fingers twitching as if they want to grab the world but don't yet know how. Feeding a medieval child isn't like offering colourful baby food or store-bought snacks. It's a delicate dance between survival and hope. You prepare a thin gruel, barely thicker than water, from barley flour mixed with water, and maybe a pinch of salt if you're lucky. It's lukewarm, often gritty, but it's all you have to offer. Children are the most vulnerable in this world. Their tiny stomachs and developing bodies demand more nutrients than you can reliably provide. Infant mortality is high and childhood illnesses are brutal. You watch the child suck at the gruel with awkward determination, sometimes coughing from the texture or temperature, but refusing to stop. Feeding isn't just about nutrition, it's about keeping hope alive, one spoonful at a time. Historically, medieval children often started on gruels and pottages made from ground grains or legumes. Mothers and caregivers would add whatever flavouring they could scavenge, sometimes a bit of ale or honey if fortune smiled. But these meals were thin and low in protein, leading to nutritional deficiencies. Weaning was a gradual process, and children were sometimes nursed for years, especially if alternative foods were scarce. Here's a quirky fact. Some medieval texts recommended adding ashes or burnt breadcrumbs to children's food, believing it would help digestion or ward off illness. Not exactly what modern paediatricians suggest, but desperate times called for desperate measures. There's also evidence that some cultures use sweetened wine diluted with water to ease teething pains. Scholars debate how much these feeding practices impacted child survival rates. Some argue that limited diets contributed to chronic malnutrition and stunted growth. Others highlight the role of communal care, breastfeeding practices, and herbal remedies in boosting resilience. It's clear that feeding a child was an act of love and courage in a harsh world. You gently wipe the child's chin with a rag, feeling the grit and warmth of the gruel against your skin. The child's eyes meet yours, bright and trusting despite the hardships. You whisper a promise to feed, protect, and endure. It's a small vow, but it carries the weight of generations. Outside, the village stirs with the dawn. You breathe deeply, gathering strength for the day ahead. The pot simmers softly, the fire crackles, and the child's stomach holds steady. For now, that's enough. Women like you are the unsung heroes of survival. From dawn to dusk, you juggle countless tasks, tending the fire, gathering water, mending clothes, and above all, keeping the household fed. You know the value of every grain, every herb, every scrap of meat. You're the alewife brewing the village's lifeline, the market woman haggling for a better price, the cook who turns scraps into sustenance. Without you, the fragile balance of daily life would crumble. Your hands are calloused, your back sore, but your spirit is unyielding. You've learned recipes passed down from your mother and grandmother, ways to stretch a meal that would shame a king's banquet. Your kitchen is small, barely a corner of the home, but it's where magic happens, where boiled leaves become comfort, and stale bread is reborn as pottage thickener. Historically, women bore the primary responsibility for food preparation in the medieval households. Alewives brewed and sold beer, a staple beverage safer than water. Market women controlled much of the local economy, buying, selling and bartering goods. They were often the first to notice shortages and adapt diets accordingly. Their knowledge of herbs, foraging and preservation was vital to community health. A quirky fact: alewives sometimes faced suspicion and accusations of witchcraft, partly because of their knowledge of herbs and fermentation. Brewing was a mix of science and superstition, and successful alewives wielded significant social influence, sometimes becoming central figures in their villages. Scholars debate the social status and power of women in medieval food culture. Some argue that women were marginalised and their work undervalued. Others highlight that within the domestic sphere and local markets, women exercise considerable agency and expertise, shaping dietary practices and community well-being. In many ways, they were the backbone of medieval survival. You knead dough with practiced hands, humming a quiet tune as you work. The children play nearby, their laughter a balm against the hardships. You measure herbs from the garden, choosing a handful of thyme and rosemary to add to tonight's stew. It's not just food, it's medicine, comfort, and tradition all rolled into one. As the sun sets, you serve the evening meal. It's simple but nourishing, a testament to your resilience and skill. Everyone eats, no one goes hungry, and the cycle continues. You watch the faces around the table, tired but alive, and you know that your work matters. In the grand story of survival, women like you keep the flame burning. Plague rations. The phrase alone tightens your throat and quickens your pulse. The village is cloaked in fear. Whispers of sickness are spreading faster than the disease itself. Markets are emptier, neighbours avoid one another, and the pot on your hearth grows quieter. When the Black Death sweeps through, food becomes a weapon, a comfort, and a scarcity all at once. You learn quickly what it means to eat during a pandemic. Your meals have shrunk, no longer hearty pottages, but thin, watery slops that barely coat your tongue. Leftovers are hoarded, reheated, and passed around like precious relics. Food safety is an afterthought, survival is paramount. You wash hands in vinegar if you remember, but often your fingers are raw and cracked from fetching water. You scavenge what you can, some dried beans, stale bread, a few scraps of salted pork. Anything else might be contaminated, and you cannot risk sickness. Historically, plagues devastated food supplies and labour forces. Fields went untended, livestock starved, and trade halted. The shortage of workers led to economic upheaval, but for the common folk it meant hunger alongside disease. Communities struggled to maintain even the barest food rations, often relying on monasteries or charity for relief. Still, mistrust and fear bred hoarding and social breakdown. Here's a grim, quirky fact. During plague years, some people believed that certain foods could ward off infection: garlic, onions, and even crushed herbs tied around the neck. Others thought that eating sparrows or toads had protective properties. These beliefs, while medically useless, offered psychological comfort in desperate times. Scholars debate the extent to which the plague influenced medieval diets. Some suggest it caused permanent shifts, pushing communities towards simpler, more sustainable foodways. Others highlight how disruptions led to famines and malnutrition, compounding the death toll. The Black Death reshaped society, but it also exposed the fragility of medieval food systems. You stir your pot quietly, adding a splash of vinegar to mask the bitterness. The children eat slowly, eyes hollow but alive. You share what little you have, knowing that in this darkness food is both a scarce resource and a rare gesture of hope. Outside, the village is hushed, shadows deepening under heavy skies. You hold on to the warmth from the hearth and the promise of another day. In plague times, that's everything. By now, you've come to realise that what didn't kill you might just make you tougher. Well, if your gut doesn't revolt first. You've chewed through crusty bread, sipped weak ale, scavenged bitter greens and boiled questionable bits of meat. Your body is a patchwork of scars and adaptations hardened by years of rough meals and constant hunger. The medieval stomach is a marvel of endurance, able to digest what modern palates would call tragedy. You glance at your worn wooden bowl, nicked and stained from countless meals. It's not pretty, and the food it holds is rarely delicious, but it keeps you alive, and sometimes, in this life, that's victory enough. You've come to accept that the medieval diet wasn't about flavour or choice. It was about survival, one bite at a time. Historically, medical texts from the Middle Ages acknowledged the toll that poor diet took on the body, but offered little relief for the common folk. Nutrition was tied to humours, balance, and seasonal availability more than to vitamins and calories. Your survival depended less on science and more on stubbornness, community, and the ability to eke out nourishment from the barest scraps. Here's a quirky fact to chew on. Some medieval peasants believed that eating certain hardy foods, like black bread or salted pork, made their guts stronger, almost like a rite of passage. There's a folk wisdom that toughness came from eating toughness, which probably helped explain why you can tolerate a pottage that would send a modern diner running. Scholars debate how the medieval diet influenced long-term health. Some evidence points to surprisingly robust dental health and fewer signs of scurvy than expected, likely due to high fibre and herbal content. Others note that malnutrition, parasites and infectious diseases were rampant, and average life expectancy was low. Survival wasn't about thriving, it was about outlasting the next crisis. You swallow the last bite, lean back and let out a slow breath. The fire crackles softly, shadows dancing on the walls. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, gathering, boiling, eating. But for tonight, you rest. Your belly isn't full, but it's fed, you survived, and sometimes that's enough.